on the way back from the tube run based on the feedback I got from all those smartphones that I spoke to. Was the idea of the dashboard that helps engineers just to understand what's happening in the cluster in the first place.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 181, Monitoring Kubernetes with Kubevious. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick.
I've been trying to play more and more with Kubernetes. You know that that's not my day-to-day thing. And the one thing that just sort of makes my mind melt is trying to figure out how to do things the right way, whatever right is.
Makes you wonder whether there is one right way for everybody. Because, my logic usually is that if there is one right way to do something, then that right way would be baked into that product, tool, platform, service, right? But typically there is more than one right way. Like, you work with Jenkins, right? What is the right way? There are certain best practices that apply to everybody, and then there are certain practices that apply only to a specific organization, right? That's why I stopped using the term best practices. They're kind of misleading. Good practice or good way. Slightly, lowering the expectations so that it's slightly clearer that some things are universal and some things are specific.
Best for me. Maybe not best for everybody.
Best for you today.
Time bound is a very important thing. On today's show, we have Ruben Hakopian on with us from Kubevious. Ruben, how you doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Why don't you take a moment and tell us a little bit about Kubevious, and let's talk about, okay, Victor's already sort of gone down the path of, there really isn't such things as best practices. But I think in the world of just raw Kubernetes, just the baseline of it, we've got to have some best practices that probably everybody should adhere to.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say there are some common practices. There are some good practices from the security point of view, and there are some other best practices for SREs and DevOps. So definitely different best practices, and if not, we wouldn't have so many opinionated platforms that promote their own best practices. I think that's definitely true, and it varies from company to company as well.
So what are some of those common practices that everybody should follow? To me, that seems like the lowest common denominator. Like, should they plug in their power to multiple redundant power? I mean, come on, that's not exactly it, but it's those kinds of things.
I mean, in the context of Kubernetes, it's like running as least privileged containers and workloads as possible, or maybe the most common ones also would be not using latest tags and being more specific what you run within your clusters. But things can progress from there into much more complicated and sophisticated scenarios, like validating and making sure that things that you run within your clusters are, are using horizontal pod autoscalers. If that's the right way that your organization, your platform team, and SREs decided to do.
And I would like to hear your opinion about that. From my perspective, the challenge that we are facing right now is that things are distributed, whatever the things are. While in the past, we had one big thing of something, right? And you just mentioned horizontal pod autoscaler. If I simplify the rule and say the good practice would be to have more than one replica, right? Then accomplishing that practice can be done in many different ways. Kind of like, hey, is the number of replicas set on a deployment manifest? Maybe it's not, but maybe there is HPA. Or maybe that there is no HPA because there is VPA because that application for this reason or another cannot scale, right? So I feel like that many companies or projects are approaching it from a relatively simplistic perspective. I'm going to tell you whether this thing is correct, while I feel that the key is really looking at the system as a whole. I mean, of course, we need to validate or make sure that individual resource types are good, right? But somehow that there is more to that than just saying replicas.
Absolutely. So things are, of course, very different from use case to use case, right? So there are certain things that shouldn't be done in a way or used in a certain way, regardless of the company, let's say. Label typos or naming issues. Those are the things that are happening from time to time, right? If you're referencing a pod that is not there, or Ingress is referencing a service which is not there. So we could say it's a common practice. There are other practices that companies should have to decide on their own that this is the way that we're going to use the platform, which nowadays is Kubernetes, which probably is one of the first things comes to your mind when you're about to deploy an application, right? And if you're starting on a new platform. In those cases, it will be probably up to the platform teams to come up with the ways that would be the norm for the application engineers and SREs to deploy apps on top. We're kind of getting close to what Kubevious does, and I probably would take this opportunity and tell you a little bit about it. Kubevious is an open source project and SaaS offering which helps engineers running modern cloud native applications, of course, on top of Kubernetes without misconfigurations, typos, and violations to best practices. And it does it in a really, really interesting way. So what Kubevious does, it looks to your cluster. It looks to the manifests that are running within the cluster, and it correlates those manifests together, and it puts them under the definition of the application. So it understands that there are deployments, there are pods, there are services, ingresses, and all those things are connected to each other. And then it runs the validation logic on top of it. So as a result, it can validate and enforce best practices that are spanning across multiple manifests. I'll just give you a simple example. If your platform team decides that certain workloads would have to run with a horizontal pod autoscaler or maybe a vertical pod autoscaler, so you would be able to enforce those policies on top of your workloads. Another example would be limiting usage of or access to API server to certain workloads. Maybe you want to prevent access to secrets to certain workloads. So usually those things involve multiple manifests, let's say all the way from the pod deployment to service account, bindings, and the roles. So such really sophisticated use cases can be relatively easily enforced using Kubevious.
What you just mentioned is in my head one of the main limitations we have today on Kubernetes side alone. Because Kubernetes brought very early admission controllers, but they're limited always and exclusively to a single resource, right? You cannot, I might be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you cannot use admission controllers for something like that to enforce or certain rules that are tied to an application or a group of resources, not on a specific resource.
Yeah, with admission controller, you're only limited within a single manifest to make a determination whether the change is good or not. And any solution that relies only on admission controller is limited to visibility of a single manifest. So it means you don't have a complete context, you don't have a full picture to decide whether the changes should be accepted or it should be rejected. Because of that limitation, in Kubevious, we're doing it a little bit different way. So as of right now, there are two layers where we enforce and detect violations to best practices. Is one of them, that's how the project started, is a continuous validation of the actual changes that are already present within the cluster. You can use it as an audit or for forensic purposes. And very recently, we added the ability for the enforcement. We called it Kubevious Guard. So it's basically a simple script. you pipe all your manifests into the scripts, and then it validates the entire package as a whole. So it tries to simulate the changes that would happen on top of the cluster with your package of changes, and it checks what would happen without your changes. And if your change causes more harm than it solves, then it would prevent those changes from getting in. And yeah, of course, this runs outside of the Kubernetes because of the limitations in admission controller. But yeah, so we have to find our ways around this. And another level of enforcement would be through the continuous validation. That would be, as of right now, it would be informational.
Yeah, when you say outside of Kubernetes, I guess you don't mean literally, kind of it's still running in a cluster, but not leveraging Kubernetes.
Yeah, it's running, it may run within the cluster if your CD is running inside cluster, let's say in Argo. But I mean, you can still go ahead and do kube control apply and make some cause some violations. But yeah, I know that you should, but it's kind of possible.
How did it all start? Were you trying to solve something for yourself, or you saw the need in the market, or how did that day when you woke up with the idea look like?
This is how it worked. It was 2019. I went to KubeCon in San Diego. I was working on another project of mine. It was tied to deployment, like the day one operations. And I went to KubeCon to get some feedback. And as a result of the feedback, I decided that this project is not going to run. And on the way back from the KubeCon, based on the feedback I got from all those smart folks that I spoke to, was the idea of the dashboard that helps engineers just to understand what's happening in the cluster in the first place. So it started with just a simple dashboard. There's no rules engine. There are no validations. It's just a very graphical UI that shows the composition of the apps. So it correlates kind of the basic constructs in Kubernetes. It was centered to the applications. It shows so apps are first level citizens in Kubevious. It shows how apps are exposed to the internet, how services, config maps, and all those standard resources are connected to each other. And then slowly, as we started building the product, and then I realized that, hold on. If there is a service referencing pods and the pods are not there, maybe it's an error, right? So you're pointing to something which is not there. And slowly it started, like the internal validation logic started to emerge. And then at some point there was a feedback saying, I want to validate my own things. That's how we exposed the rules engine to the outside. And that's how kind of the project came across.
I'm curious, how do you know that something is an application? You mentioned a couple of times. Is it because I made it be an application to Kubevious, or can you correlate somehow? Can you know that something is an application if I do kubectl apply simply?
Well, in the end of the day, there will be pod running, right? So it starts from a pod, it goes all the way up, it figures out what caused the pod to come up, and then probably there used to be a replication controller. Now it's a replica set, and there's a deployment or cron job. So it goes all the way up, and wherever it lands, it kind of decides that that's enough.
But like it has a service you cannot follow like that, right?
With services, it's a little bit harder because you may have multiple services for a single app.
I don't know. It's kind of I'm constantly perplexed or confused that Kubernetes itself never thought of some kind of app model, some kind of saying, yeah, okay, you have those Lego building blocks kind of like, but all those things together are something.
The moment it does it, it becomes Heroku.
True. Fair enough. Touché. True.
Yeah. You don't want to make it too opinion.
No, but
you don't want to make it too much opinion.
No, I didn't mean opinionated. I meant more like establishing relation that those resources are, whichever you define yourself, are one coherent group, right? So if I now send kubectl apply in the directory, and I have an ingress and a service and deployment and virtual service and what's not, there is no method baked into Kubernetes to say, yes, all those things are related somehow.
There is.
Really?
There is. It's called labels. There are special labels where you
true.
can give naming. The challenge is that it's up to the user to use those labels correctly, is to apply the same labels on the config maps and other resources. That's hard. That's really hard. So that's why Kubevious doesn't use any of those labels. It tries to re-implement. Yeah, it has to use heuristics and the same logic of Kubernetes, the way it kind of brings up the workloads. And that's how it reconstructs the application state.
Well, it seems like if we could use labels consistently, that would make your life a lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely. For example, there is a case when if you're running Redis on top of Kubernetes, usually it would be in a form of multiple types of deployments. Let's say one type of deployment for master and the other one for slaves. In Kubevious, as of right now, it would show two different applications, although it will show that each of them has a service which is shared across multiple apps, because it would think that they're completely independent. It doesn't kind of constitute an error. It's just an indication for you that there are things running across apps. Maybe in some cases we could use labels. It just we would have to use it consistently, and not everyone is using labels consistently.
Oh no. Not only that not everyone is using, but most people are not even using those recommended by Kubernetes. Kubernetes IO/name kind of. I never see that label being used by anybody.
Name the app, right? Yeah. Component of.
Yeah, exactly.
There's another one.
Is that something that Kubevious could help tell people, hey, have you considered adding component of?
I think, yeah, it's possible. It's just imagine you would receive a couple of hundred such recommendations.
Here's a question based on me. I mean, I used Kubevious in the past. I'm not up to date with how it looks like right now, so I might be asking something silly. But when you give me the information that something is wrong or not according to the best practices or whatever the naming is, can you distinguish what matter and what doesn't in some way? Because, my constant problem, this is not about Kubevious, just to clarify, but in general, is very often, if I go back like 20 years when I used SonarType, right, SonarCube, my always problem was, so there are 5,000 things that I did wrong. I cannot deal with this, kind of like, I don't know where to start.
Yeah, that's a challenge, to be honest. And sometimes we have seen on certain setups, like there would be a flood of warnings and errors. Recently, we kind of added the ability to control the severity, so you can fine-tune things. For example, if it detects that there are, let's say, bindings or roles that are not in use in the cluster, so by default it will trigger a warning. Because the reason the reasons may be different why you would have, let's say, a role which nobody is using. Maybe you were supposed to reference that role, but you made a typo and you referenced another one. Maybe it would be, I would recommend kind of turning on and off those checks on an intermittent basis, and so that you can kind of go over it once, and maybe you could turn off some of the checks later on. You could do kind of clean up your clusters with one check at a time. And at some point on the production or staging clusters, it should be pretty clean and out of most of the errors.
What has been one of the most interesting use cases that you've seen Kubevious used for? I mean, obviously it's to make sure, but okay, it's not really interesting, but it's like, what's the one time when somebody says, if it wasn't for Kubevious, we would have been toast? Have you had any of those stories?
The time machine is super interesting. I had a reference on the time machine on a couple of occasions. So Kubevious is recording the entire history of the cluster in a timeline. So it lets you travel back in time up to 2 weeks, and you could kind of keep the whole history of the cluster. Of course, one might reference that DOPs would solve all the problems, but there are certain things that could bypass the Git history, especially with the operator pattern. State of the cluster may change bypassing the changes in the Git pipeline. That's one of the things that on a couple of occasions I had been referenced to.
So is it informational only? Sorry for interrupting. Is it informational, or you can kind of move back in time?
You only move back in time within the cluster, but you could use it for debugging when certain incidents arise. You could go back in time and you could take your time and analyze and do your forensics, understand why this happened. There's no good way to export it, although you could use REST APIs. But Kubevious is read-only. We probably would never want to start making changes to the cluster because it would cause more harm than good. You could extract those manifests. You could understand what did you do wrong at a certain point in time. Another good one that was highly referenced is ability to detect things across manifests, especially in the network policies and RBAC. Those are the things that usually involve multiple manifests, and you could easily write a simple rule that would say, don't allow access to secrets to any of the apps that are using certain images.
The images that you downloaded from non-friendly countries, don't use secrets there. Okay, got it. If somebody was to install Kubevious late, meaning they've had a cluster in place for months, years, is it just from that starting point? In other words, am I capturing data? Does my time machine start on that installation? Obviously, I would assume it does, right?
That's right, yeah.
And my time machine out of the box is only 2 weeks?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
So what happens when I get to that third week and I need to go back to week 1? I'm toast?
So you can go back 2 weeks, but so it's a rolling window. It keeps purging the history after on 15th day.
What are you using for your persistence layer?
It's a MySQL database, and it's stored within the cluster. And we're talking about the open source project, right?
Yeah.
So in the SaaS offering, it's slightly different, but very similar.
So there is open source version, there is enterprise. What are the differences? Is it like a typical enterprise stuff, more security, things like that, or?
Almost. So it's pretty standard. So it's a SaaS based on the open source project. It's literally the same value prop, almost the same product. It's just it runs in the cloud, so you don't have to run all this machinery, MySQL, Redis, and everything within your cluster. So instead, there would be a stateless agent, tiny little bit of an agent. Kubevious runs with one single cluster. So basically, you install within a cluster, it monitors the cluster itself. With a SaaS offering, you can deploy it on multiple clusters. You have one single dashboard, and then you can search across clusters. You can enforce policies across clusters.
Let me see if I understand that right. So if I go completely open source, I install everything into my cluster. It's just self-contained. However, with the SaaS, I get an agent in my cluster that is then dialing home and sending the data back up to the cloud, and then I can do roll-ups across n number of clusters of the data.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
You would still debug and kind of monitor your clusters independently, even in the SaaS offering, but there are certain capabilities, just like the rules, and there is some search engine that allows you to search for things. So that capability would also let you search things across clusters. Let's say you want to search for certain image, which I don't know, which has certain port exposed.
Yeah, well, you're looking for a certain image. Let's say I'm large company X, and I'm running multi-clusters to cover me globally. Well, that image would live in all those clusters all over the world. And I'm just trying to search it down to find out, okay, what's my exposure here, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, with open source, you would have to do it separately in each individual cluster. Right.
If I had to search for something in an individual cluster, so I've got I'm assuming a UI pops up, right? So it's you're dependent upon an ingress or something to exist already. Do you have a specific ingress you're expecting, or how does that UI pop out for me?
You could use port forwarding, but usually people would expose it through an ingress. Yeah.
Okay.
And the way to protect it right now, there is no integrated RBAC within Kubevious, so you would have to use some sort of API gateway to password protect it.
So we've talked about Kubevious open source. We've talked about Kubevious, the product. Are you planning on doing an offering to have the enterprise version that I could install without having to use the SaaS? Like a fully self-managed option?
Yeah, at some point we'll have a shippable version of the SaaS offering, basically the same SaaS running within your premises. I think we have to nail down a little bit the use case a little bit more, just to create some solutions for specific target companies, like with packages that are a little bit more fine focused, like for security users, for compliance, so that we have a ready to use packages to offer. Because right now there is a very powerful rules engine, but we need to have come up with some use cases just before we start working on this shippable version.
What is your rules engine today? What's it based on? Is it homegrown, or did you base it on?
It's homegrown. Anything that you see out there is limited to one single manifest validation at a time. So we had to improvise. It's a little bit different. So you write the rules in a similar way you navigate the UI. So there are two parts for the rule or the policy. In the first part, you say on which node of the entire graph to land on. Which could be the app or different components of the app. Let's say ingress, service, config map, secret, anything that comes to your mind. In the different part, in the rules validation logic, you write a simple if then else logic to determine whether there is some violation or not. It's based on JavaScript, and you have complete access to your cluster resources. You have access to application notion. So for example, if you're within the scope of the application, you can basically do application.service or application.ingress.config, and you have full access to your ingress or service manifest. And then you do the determination whether it's a good change or bad change. Actually, things are not black and white. You can also detect things that are of a special interest using a feature called markers. So you can associate special icons with every single resource within your cluster. It doesn't mean those resources are harmful or you have to do something with them. It's just for you maybe to keep track of those workload or resources. Let's say you want to know when engineers are deploying more stateful apps or public apps, exposing them to the internet, or stateful public apps, or like any apps that are reading or writing for certain CRDs. So you could write those rules just to associate the icons, and then you can easily monitor for changes for such for those markers.
So did I understand it right? Kind of basically you create some kind of labels that are evaluated based on certain rules. I'm not labeling ingress, say I want this ingress to be yellow, but if it matches this rule, if this if statement or whatever it is, then paint it red, something like that. It's really cool.
Yeah. One more difference in the SaaS offering is that it allows integration with Slack channels. Within the Slack, you can monitor for subscribe to changes for those markers. And as soon as there are changes that would kind of cause the labeling to happen or labeling would go away, that you would get to know about those changes immediately.
Are those labels, I'm just thinking aloud, are they only available in Kubevious or you are mutating the resources themselves?
No, they're only in Kubevious. Only Kubernetes. So let's say somebody would deploy an app without network policies, and you want to know about that. So instead of rejecting those changes, although you completely could reject those changes through the guard, maybe you want to be a little bit more loose on this and be more permissive. So, but you want to know when there are certain apps deployed that match certain conditions, and they're deployed without any ingress network policies. So you would assign an icon to it. And then you would either kind of regularly check for changes for those, or use the SAS offering to get notified immediately.
Very cool. How can people find you? How can they? I guess Kubevious, is it IO?
Yeah, you just write Kubevious in Google. Yeah, it's IO. Fortunately, the name wasn't taken at the time we were registering the domain. It's like, yeah, you just Kubevious.
So it's obviously Kubevious, right?
Yeah.
Obviously Kubevious. Yeah. Okay. In case you're wondering how to spell Kubevious, just replace ob with cube, and you're good to go.
Exactly. Yeah.
So all of Ruben's contact information is going to be down in the show notes. But Ruben, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do it?
Either Twitter, or you guys can reach out to me on the Slack channel of Kubevious. Go through kubevious.io. There will be the link to the Slack channel. You can email me at r@kubevious.io. So there are lots of ways to reach out. Yeah, just
R at.
Just R. Yeah.
The joys of starting your own
yeah.
mail service. You can set whatever you want for your names. Okay. Ruben, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks a lot, Darren. Thanks a lot, Victor. Pleasure to be here.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.